I'm being the National Commercialization Manager, and I'm going to be introducing today's speakers. So for my role here, I'm working primarily in this early stage commercialization space, so trying to figure out ways in which we can capture the value coming from university and Crown research. And so it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce these two speakers to you, because this is the exact area that they're in. They're actually leading experts in this area, and we do this stuff every day. So to introduce them, Will Charles, here in the blue jacket, is he's currently at Uni Services, which, if you don't know Uni Services, it's the biggest company of its kind, commercialization company of its kind in Australasia. At Uni Services, Will has done a ton of different licensing deals, I think over 100 in nature, started up 13 startup companies, and he also established the Trans Australian Commercialization Fund. And prior to coming to Uni Services, Will was in Big Pharma in Asia, Europe, New Zealand. So he's worked at GlaxoSmithKline, Novartis, Celtec, and Roche. Yeah, so he's had a really great background in this space. Ken, here in the green jacket, is professor at Auckland University in the business school there. He comes from Denmark, and he did his PhD at the Copenhagen Business School. He is specialising, his research interests are right in the innovation and research space. So he's interested in research and development, collaborations, science and innovation policy, knowledge management, and commercialisation in sort of low and medium high tech firms. So again, really, really relevant space for us to hear about. So great pleasure, introduce them both, and here's Will.
Thanks. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along today. It's always a pleasure to be here, and it's a privilege to be able to speak to you today. So thank you very much. I was going to just go through today talking a little bit about Uni Services and commercialization. I use sort of 3 exemplars of really the challenges and opportunities that we face in this space, and so and also some of the things which we're thinking about in terms of how we move forward, some of the smaller interventions that perhaps government can help us with in order to address some of those problems. But before I do, I always just wanted to make sure that we'll just see that people know who Uni Services are. We are a standalone contract. I'm going forward, sorry. A standalone contract research company, $145 million worth of revenue, and we've doubled in 5 years. But I think really the most important thing at the bottom there is that we are now really an entrepreneurial campus. And the market cap, based on all of the activities that we do on campus, is about $500,000. We do travel a lot. I think what this tells you here is that research and research commercialization is actually an industry in and of itself, and it does contribute the export of knowledge and the export of technology through licenses, where we retain the ownership of that, is an important business in and of itself. Our business model, this is what we do. We take intellectual property from the University of Auckland and capability. We then match that with business interests, and we invest. We make investments, and we have three business lines. One is research for business. That's where companies know what their problems are, they know what they want to buy, and they buy it directly. And we do IP for business, which we call licensing, and we do new businesses, which is startups. There's a lot of debate around, and I'll come talk about this a little bit more when I actually talk about one of the examples, that actually there is an anatomy of technology transfer. And there's a lot of debate as to whether you should do, well, you just do licenses, or you just do spin-outs, or you just do contract research. They're all interrelated, and they're all effectively the same thing. They're a transfer of knowledge or transfer of IP from a research institute into the private sector. Whether that company happens to know what it wants and it wants to buy it and own it and transfer it into new products and services, or whether it doesn't, in which case we've come up with something that a company wants to buy, that's in the form of a license, or if it's an idea whose time has not come yet and there is no existing company to do it, then you have to build a management team around that in order to take that piece of IP or research idea and turn it into a product and a service. At the end of the day, the vehicle, in our view, is irrelevant. Absolutely irrelevant. The key is transforming IP research knowledge into new products and services. That's what people should focus on, is the product and service and the new customer that you're dealing with, not whether it's a spin-out or a license. So I'll just talk about something that we're relatively passionate about, because to be honest with you, in our experience, this is pretty much the way it looks like. For every 3 to 4 startups, we'll do about 40 licenses a year, and we'll be running about 1,500 contracts. So typically that is the anatomy of intellectual property. If you take that beneath that, in the way in which knowledge is transferred to the private sector, underneath that is another 2 areas where knowledge is transferred. That's the employment of students, and then the publication of papers. Knowledge is transferred in the same way, it's just actually broader pyramid base. So just talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunities that we face. This, there's a reason why not many people do this, is there is no money. The value of death is a well-known and well-understood concept in the process of technology transfer, from large research grants through to venture capital and private equity and the market. There is very, very little capital available to transfer some of these ideas from the lab into products. And typically the reason why there is a lot of capital is it takes a long time, so returns are very uncertain and returns take a long time to come through. The other thing that is true in New Zealand is that there is, in our experience, a lack of entrepreneurs. And when I say lack of entrepreneurs, there's lots of people who come up with good ideas and take it to a certain level, but there is a lack of real true entrepreneurs who can take it and build a business, a real sustainable business. And then to support them, if I made an observation from having worked in around the Cambridge area in the UK, having worked with a number of people in large companies, and my background was I was a product manager. Most of the people who I was product managers with, when I talk about product managers are people who can take something from R&D and then actually give it to a salesperson who can then sell it. That's what I describe as product management, do that profitably. A lot of my colleagues who went off to start companies and have been CEOs of biotech companies and other companies started their careers as product management. And they went to large companies, got trained, but when they were about 27, 28, they left those companies. Right now, New Zealand doesn't have a history of people leaving Fonterra having been a product manager and starting companies. It doesn't. And these other places, in fact, do. And so we don't have a lot of people who, we have a lack of entrepreneurs, managers and directors who really understand this space. So we have to nurture them, we have to create them, we have to create environments into which they want to work. And I'll just give some examples of how we've started to think about that. Because I'm here in Wellington and I'm a passionate believer in it, I want to just talk a little bit about the value in this space, the value of the devolved Pre-Seed Accelerator Fund. I think it was around about 10 years ago. It's been in existence. It's my experience. It's probably one of the smallest funds that the government makes available. One in which has the most debate about it, and probably one which is never really sort of thought of as being as valuable. I want to tell you here and now, it's one of the most valuable funds that the government puts on the table. I'll give you an example about why in a minute. Talk a little bit about building an entrepreneurial campus, an exemplar of how that worked, and then some of the new initiatives which we're trying to deal with, the issues of lack of people and lack of capital. So just the first 2 examples relate to IPT, which is the transfer of power without wires. And just to give you an example of that, again, why this debate about whether you do a startup or a spin-out is irrelevant. is because since 1990, when this was first discovered, there are now 6 different licensees, some of which are spin-outs. Some of those spin-outs have been acquired and are therefore now licenses. But the important thing here is, and again another thing that's potentially interesting, there's also a mantra, a little bit of a mantra around some of the way that things are funded, that IP needs to be owned by the business. And yeah, it can be, that's fine. But at the end of the day, remember that companies come and companies go and companies get sold. There is an argument, and so we passionately believe that IP should be developed and made into products by the private sector. And in many cases, it should be owned by the private sector. However, there are times when actually ownership by the private sector is actually detrimental to New Zealand, because of big investments are made in IP that then typically is sold overseas and in relatively short order. And the benefit, therefore, is lost to New Zealand. There is, universities are always enduring institutions. They will always be a University of Auckland. There will always be a University of Otago. They're enduring institutions. It's actually, in some cases, quite useful if you say that those enduring institutions own the IP. You can license it. An exclusive license, worldwide license, is exactly the same as transferring ownership. The only, perhaps, difference is the difference between a freehold and leasehold. If you go to some countries, the only land you can ever buy is leasehold. It's the only difference. So I'll just talk a little bit about that. But if you think here, the irrelevance of whether it's a spin-out or a license, as I said, it's 5 different fields of use here. Some of those companies started as spin-outs. Now they're licenses because those companies were acquired, and those companies have direct licenses with us. There are 3 companies that started in New Zealand as a result of this IP that was generated because we licensed it first to a large company overseas and were able to reinvest the money in developing new applications that then turned into spin-out companies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about power by proxy, and I'm going to talk about Halo IPT. So just to give you an example, and this is why pre-seed accelerated fund is so valuable. If you think about, we've been able to transfer power across the gap, and what's not well known is around 75% of the world's microchips and flat panel displays. The reason why these are so cheap, is that you can make them in factories that are automated, and in order for them to be automated, they have to be clean. Now, if you want to move anything around on a track, if it's got contacts, it's going to produce particles, so it's very difficult to keep a clean room. If you can move those tracks and power the things that are moving those things around wirelessly, you don't get any residue, and therefore the rooms stay clean. So you can have automated clean rooms, and they used our IPT for 20 years they've been using it. It's a $1 billion market, by the way, and we've done quite well out of it in terms of what we've been able to build as in terms of new IP, research, new companies as a result of that. But what we've been able to do, so the gap was very narrow. And what happened was in 2007, we started looking, electric vehicles started to become, or were likely to become, ubiquitous. It actually took Toyota 11 years to sell 1 million units of the Prius. They started in 1996. They sold their 1,000,000th unit in 2007. And there was this kind of potential hockey stick for electric vehicles, and we looked at that. We said, well, if they're going to be plugged in, the plug's not very, it's not a very attractive proposition. And we went to the car industry, but we knew we were on a long journey here. We knew we were a really long journey. We went to the car industry, and we said, well, we've done this, and we can put power across a gap like this. And they said, well, that's interesting. How efficient? We said, well, about 85%. Well, that's fine. Well, they said, well, that all sounds really interesting, but to be honest with you, we need you to be able to do a gap like this. It needs to go like this, up and down, because we might have punctures or the roads might go. We need you to do this, because people don't park very well, or they might be driving, or whatever. It needs to not throw magnetic field everywhere, so because there are regulations around magnetic field. And their last throwaway line was, oh yeah, and it should be as efficient as a plug. And that kind of last line was, thank you very much, we'll see you later. But so what we were able to do there is, and this is, there's a lot of research in this space, there's a lot of research around electric vehicles, and we weren't alone, but what we were able to do with that 4 pieces of information, you could take those 4 bits of information, so we can do this, we know what to do, and you could go out to private capital and you could say, well, we know what to do, we know there's a market if we do it, but it's still going to be about 8 to 10 years before you see any sales in this. That's quite a hard sell to a venture capital that's running a 5 to 7 year fund. It just doesn't happen. If we had had to apply for, so this could be a smart idea, right? It's a smart idea. We know what to do. It's the market. You bang in, you come up against, but there's an annual cycle. Well, we'll have to wait until March, and then you go through the application process and yada yada, right? All of these things are great. They're just in terms of the timing of some of these things. So, Pre-Seed Accelerated Fund is the only one that we were able to just immediately, you can apply it. You just go, okay, well, what's a good idea? Let's do it. And you say to the scientist, don't care how you do it, but here's the parameters. You've got 9 months to fix this problem. And we gave them, so now the reason why Pre-Seed Accelerated Fund was so useful there is because it was devolved, we could do that immediately. What that actually meant was we were able to be alone in the market. Just to give you an example of how important that was, we found out there's about 5 or 6, in doing this challenge, you set somebody like John Boyes and Grant Kovic, a challenge like that, they will come up with novel solutions. There's about 11 new patent families that they came up with as a result of that expenditure. But the important point about that was that we beat the Koreans by 3 weeks, both to the patent office and in terms of when the research was done. So if we'd had to wait or we'd missed it, it's 3 weeks. So we had priority over. So that's a good news story. Anyway, enabled us to go to Norway, and we were the first one there. People were sort of relatively incredulous. And yes, this did all of the things it did, and yes, it is as efficient as a plug. Everybody goes, how can that be? Because when you have to take a plug and then put it to a battery, you have to run it through a transformer, because you can't put AC directly into a battery. So what we've effectively done is expanded out a transformer. So it is as efficient as a plug, and that's what we did. But what it enabled us to then do was be relevant, and we could then partner. So we partnered with a lot of OEMs, and enabled that cooperation to occur. And this is the important thing. So again, just talking about. So in the end, what happened was we were looking for extra capital, and what happens when you start to get into these sorts of markets is they start to get standards driven. And if something's going to get globally standards driven, you have to have a relatively big gorilla in the room, or be a big gorilla. Otherwise, you just get kind of ignored. Or a standard is adopted that isn't necessarily the best, because the big gorilla will do what the big gorilla does. So we were out looking for money, and at that time when we were out looking for money, Qualcomm came along, and they purchased the assets of Halo. And this is what's really important, why Qualcomm was such an attractive deal for us, particularly in a New Zealand context. The first was that because we had invested in the Pre-Seed Accelerator Fund, we retain ownership of the IP. I didn't want anybody to be misunderstood that. The IP stays in New Zealand, we still own it. We've got a big company that can protect it, and we've got a big company that can help us generate global standards such that our IP will retain its relevance globally. Their business model, which is really attractive to us, is it's a licensing business model. They make product only to set a standard. Once they've made that product, set the standard, they then license that to anyone else, and they collect royalties from it. And what that enabled us to do is those licensees then differentiate based on different features. That's enabled us to continue discussion. There are some New Zealand high-tech manufacturing companies that are in discussion with Qualcomm as the next generation of electric vehicles, which will start to have wireless charging capability. You'll see them in the market in about 2 to 3 years' time. Will be able to continue to make a product based on our IP. Because we're close, we will be producing graduates that will be able to work for these companies and develop products that will be made under license for Qualcomm and generating revenue and generating jobs. The key thing is that research stays in New Zealand. If I said, well, why were we able to keep that research in New Zealand, was because we were able to move quickly, pre-seed accelerator fund, and get this done. So the future, and this is what we're doing research in now, we're in the process of thinking about building a road, which will have pads in it, which you'll drive along and be able to get charged on the move. Cars without batteries, ultimately, is the goal, but that's a 2025 vision. So that's Halo. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the importance of building an entrepreneurial campus in commercialization. And there's three things you really need to do in order to make this happen. You can do things from the top down. So we do a lot of things around, we've started to address things like promotions. We start to get the university to address the issue that publication is just as good as patented. And that's happening. You do training. So, for example, we have the Future Research Leaders Group training modules that has an entire module, I think, out of 8, that is dedicated to commercialization and IP and how important it is. And then the other thing is you can encourage commercialization through judicious use of research funds, whether those are internal funds that the Vice Chancellor puts together, or the DVCR puts together, or we put together. You can use that to encourage commercial outcomes. Then there's education, and Professor Husted will talk a little bit about education. But then, beneath that, you have to build it from the bottom up. And you have to use the energy of students and undergraduates to start to get involved and to change behaviour. Teachers will often reflect and change based on what their students and pupils tell them and do. So it's really to develop the power and energy of students. So one of the key ones around that is the Spark Business Plan competition, which has now been going, I think, since 2003, so 10 years. I'll give you an example of the story again around. So Power by Proxy was this young bunch of students who looked at our IPT systems and said, yep, that looks like a good opportunity, and there's some fields that aren't being that aren't being exploited at the moment. We think we can have a go at it. So they won the Spark Business Plan competition. Now, it's all very well, you say, well, you win a business plan competition, but if you're 21 years old and you say they came along, well, this is our business plan, and we actually challenged them and said, look, it's not one Spark, well done, but that's not a business, it's a business plan competition. You've got a business plan that's kind of not really executable here. You need to demonstrate to us that you can do this, because we don't trivially license. You don't want to trivially license your IP to a group that isn't going to do anything with it, or can't do anything with it, because that's the worst possible thing. Because either what ends up happening is you're either too late to the market, or you go with the wrong products, and effectively then your IP is pretty dead. So we challenged them to really develop their business plan, really develop some credibility. And we actually thought, actually it's a bit kind of, they thought, well, I'm not sure we'll see them again. But no, we did. They came back, found an executive chairman, found some money, and they then demonstrated to us that they had the right to secure a license to this stuff. So we gave it to them. And they first developed the first IPT slip ring. Because what was most important was they went and found a customer. And I talked about at the beginning, whether it's the vehicle is important or not. It's not, it's the customer that's important. And that's what they did. They came back and the company was John Deere, and they identified a problem with actuators and switches for the hydraulics in large forestry machines wear out. And those machines are so expensive that you just can't afford to have them not working. So they developed the slip ring, which then John Deere bought. But what was most important was this. Again, they continued their research program with us. So they've gone off, and now they've developed a number of products. They've taken their slip rings into the feathering equipment of windmills. And perhaps what's really, really neat is, and again, as a relationship we've had with them and through relations we've had, they focused on miniaturizing this IPT technology that we've got. And they now have, an IPT pickup is based in a battery, and they now have a box like this, so that you will be able to charge this simply by putting it into a box. So people say, well, it's the difference between that is, what they've identified, which isn't trivial, is existing, you see these things, power pad or whatever it is, and you have to put it on there, it has to be aligned and has to be touching. They've been able to put things on where you can have them at any angle, they don't have to be touching. So the actual IPT itself becomes a useful thing rather than just making a gimmick. And all I can say is watch this space, and just recently we've expanded our license to include all our IPT cloud bundles. So there's a story there, and the question is would Power Proxy happen without Spark? Probably not. We might have got around to it, but again, I want to come back to the premise at the beginning. There's a lack of people. Right? There's only 24 hours in a day. What this Spark competition enabled was somebody was energized and had a passion, but wanted to get involved and made something happen. And so it's things like Spark and it's things like those things that create the energy that people want to do this, because nothing happens without a person doing something. So that was an important thing. So if I'm you telling anybody, how would you do this again? Get your students involved, have a business plan competition, because that student energy and entrepreneurship drove the development and success of that. So if you've got lack of people, you've got to get people, more people. So the third one is, and this is something that we're starting to develop a little bit more, is over the sort of 7 years that I've been doing this, there's been a lot of discussions about, oh, well, should we have a database of ideas? And yes, should everybody know what we're doing? Yes, of course we should. But what my observation around databases is that they tend to be relatively dead things. They tend to be sort of things that people put, not what they're really working on, just what they happen to have a one-pager on, so it goes up there. It's kind of like, the last thing you do at night before you turn the lights out, and typically you think, well, I'll just turn the lights out and don't do. And it's probably the same for people actively looking for technology. They don't really go, oh, I'll go and look at that database. It just doesn't happen. You've got to make these things real, and you've got to build them into workflow. So over the past 5 years, we invest, well, every year we invest the best part of $3 million in proof of concept and pre-seed funds, which we leverage up with the government's fund. And about 5 years ago, my team were just doing it on what we thought were good ideas, and then the board would say, well, that seems like a good idea. Until we started to invest significant amounts of money. And the board sort of started saying, well, how are you doing that? And our board meets 6 times a year, and they've got a whole load of other things they need to deal with. And they started to they got interested in some of the projects, which is great, fantastic. You've got smart people being interested in projects. But if they're only meeting 6 times a year and they've got a whole load of other stuff to do, they're not really doing it properly because they've asked questions which we should really answer. So and eventually it got down to a grinding halt. I said, well, if the board can't let me do this job, we're going to do it. So I said, well, if I set up a process of independent investment committee management, will you, the board, let me manage, or will manage the investment committees of independent people will say, good process has been followed, and then you will just let us get on with it. And so we now do that for every single investment committee services makes, goes through 3 investment committees. And we started with 1 until the volume grew such that you needed to have 2, because what was happening is the guys engineers were sort of glazing over a little bit, not contributing when we were talking about biotechnology and new targets and whatever, and vice versa. So we split it into 2 in physical sciences and biotechnology. This year, again, volume's growing again, so we split it into 3 to have ICT, physical sciences and biotechnology. The key about that is that they're routine, they're in a diary. So every month, on the 3rd Thursday of every month is physical sciences. On the 3rd Wednesday of every month is ICT. On the 4th Thursday of every month is biological sciences. Every single one of those meetings, at least the University of Auckland's IP portfolio is reviewed, and decisions are made around investments into pieces of technology that we're going to be making. So the decisions are real, money is going to be invested. So what that does is it then makes it real in terms of a decisions being made. This is either going to be transferred, dropped, or it's going to be invested. Because we've got independent people who come in and they're independent experts, we've also started to say, well, why don't we make this live in a sense that this is actually a real database now. It's actually not just a dead thing, it's a live, living beast, right? So we, and everybody signs a CDA, but we also, it's an open meeting. People can come. Anybody who's interested can come. Provided they sign a CDA, they tell us who they are, they can come. So we have decision makers and observers. And we sort of, the next stage will be to perhaps webinar this, just thinking about how we would do that. But what it started to do is both some of the decision makers who are entrepreneurs or senior managers and people with money started to say, you know what, I'm so interested in this and I understand it so well because I've been involved in it for so long, I'll put my own money in it. And the other thing that's happened is that as a result of being involved in that, entrepreneurs have come up and said, you know, I'm so interested in that, I'm prepared to not just put my own money in it, but I'm prepared to work for sweat equity. And so we started to develop a model here where we agree what the rules are, you work for this much, we'll put this much money in. When somebody else buys this, this is how we will do a revenue share of this. So people understand what they're committing to and what their reward will be. And so we've started to get a couple of exemplars of spin-out companies where people have worked for us, entrepreneurs, committed people, have worked for us for nothing. But when somebody else runs an investment round, our typical first investment round is about $1 million, they know what they'll get and they're perfectly happy with that outcome. So they will get a significant chunk of whatever we get, alongside the revenue sharing that we get share with the inventors. That's possible because we're running this machine of monthly meetings. So those are just an exemplar. We have also now, those meetings are really the cornerstone of what we're calling return on science, the return on science investment committees. And we have thrown those committees open to other research organisations in New Zealand who want to bring their technology in front of those people, both for advice and also for whatever else might happen with it. And so we've had things from Landcare, we've had things from Victoria University, we've got a couple coming up from Canterbury, and we're working very closely with the other groups in this national network, but our differentiator in the national network is these live meetings where it's inactive. So really those are sort of three exemplars of just challenges and opportunities and some of the ideas that we're looking at to try and accelerate the commercialization of IP for New Zealand. Because my final parting point is that, as I started at the beginning, at the end of the day, this is a people business. Nothing happens. And sometimes it's difficult when you talk about this at a macro level, people talk about sectors and boxes. At the end of the day, it's people business. Nothing happens without somebody doing something. And if there's a shortage of people and a shortage of money, you've got to think creatively about how you deal with those. So those are just some things. Thank you very much. Yeah, I can take questions now.
Yeah, open it up to some questions for right now and then we'll
Here's an easy one.
Yeah.
Suppose your startup's got to the point where it needs external private equity.
Yeah.
How do you get around the problem with angels and VCs when they say, well, we've got to own the IP?
Well, the easiest way to answer that is say, I don't, if I go to America, have to give the IP away. And I would also say, in many cases, then we might even walk away from a deal if they say that. Because the issue in our experience is that these things, more often than not, these things go wrong, okay, and they fail. And they fail usually because of management failure or financing failure. It's not often technical failure that they fail. And we've had exemplars of where we have assigned IP and it's gone forever. It's failed, gone forever, sold to some, sold typically to a liquidator, it's gone scattered, probably for nothing. Nothing for it. Other times when it's come back to us, because it has been a license, we've just been able to cancel the license and we've started again. So Proacta, which has just put its second compound into clinical trials, was the third time around. So, but my answer is typically, if the other thing we could say is it then becomes a function of valuation. So I think we discussed whether the valuation's a bit lower. But honestly, my first argument is, it's not, if I go to America and you were trying to get IP from Stanford, good luck trying to get that assigned. Because I won't. The other thing to say is you can say, look, this is background IP. Just another thing we say, just to address it. This background IP we're selling to you today, this is what it is. If you're a smart company, you will go off and develop your own. So you will buy your own research and you will buy your own IP. And that makes you much more powerful. So, because what you're trying to avoid here, and there's no value to be had, to be honest with you, in selling IP to a VC who's just going to arbitrage it. We're perfectly capable of arbitraging IP. I don't need somebody to do that for me. And it's usually a good challenge of their diligence around whether they're just, this is an arbitrage play or whether they're really serious about developing products.
Any questions?
Can I ask more afterwards?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, just a really, really quick one. I'm just interested, given that you've actually started to involve other research organisations in these meetings, do you find that that's causing leading to lots of collaboration between the inventors, if you like, people who created the IP? Sort of cross-pollination of ideas?
Yeah, I do. Also, it's one of those things. Collaboration and cross-collaboration is also really important, but there is also a reality as well, is that you can't force it, and often the ideas are so specific that the chances of it's one of those things that sounds like, oh, it should happen more often, and of course it should. It's never really as a result of because they don't want to collaborate. The thing is actually because the ideas are so unique, innovative in themselves. But yes is the answer, and we've had a couple of examples already where, so we're doing this on Return on Science. We actually are working with the DTA, Defence Technologies Agency, and we had some technology came up from a CRI, and there was an immediate hit. Right? Immediately we should be talking together. So yes is the answer.
In your initial pyramid of activity at the bottom was contracts. How do you engage with business communities so they know to come to you and want to work with you in that
really, lots of ways. So from any way from having a dedicated team of business people and having open days and come and talk and engineer for a day. We run an engineer for a day program. Those sorts of voucher schemes. That's at one extreme, all the way through to the other extreme where, and we're about to do another one, is we call them open innovation deep digs. Right? So we'll go to a company and we'll say, you give us your research needs list. We'll then refine that down. Then we'll at our expense, because typically what ends up happening afterwards makes a good return for us, is we'll put 3 students, usually graduates, over the summer, and they will scour the campus with this needs list. And the only thing we ask for the company is 1 hour of a senior manager's time every week to make sure the students aren't going completely off on a tangent. And then at the end of February, the students come up with 6 or 7 ideas for the company. They present to the management. Typically what happens out of that is we'll get a small research contract which pays for the students. But most importantly, we've then got a relationship with the company. So now we know what's bothering them, and then we can create programs or potential ideas that turn into research contracts. So that's the extreme. So you invest a lot of time and money in that.
Okay, great. We can do more questions at the end. Everyone.
Okay, so I'm going to focus on research, commercialization, education. And I will start by characterizing our research commercialization and use that to specify what we actually need education for. And I'll have a look at what is going on internationally and relate that to some experiences we have had over the last couple of years from new activities at Auckland. And then finally look a little bit ahead. So when we talk about research commercialization, then we should be aware that that's actually the most difficult model for value creation. It's the most complex, it's the most uncertain, and we have heaps of characteristics. Okay. And I'm not going to go through all this, but seen from my research discipline's perspective, we have a lot of knowledge about what actually makes this model very difficult and tricky to work with. And it's related to uncertainty, it's related to that we have collaboration across different institutions with different norms and values and expectations. And it's demanding a particular toolbox, a toolbox we don't see in other area of business and management of innovation and so forth. So when I was did my PhD, I went to the most successful R&D director in Denmark, and he has been working in the area for the last 30-35 years, and have been part of building up a company with some 7,000-8,000 employees, of which 2 of them were engaged in research. And I thought, I would go straight to the core and ask him, okay, what is actually the big secret here? Because I've been reading about all these difficulties we actually have around commercializing research. And still, we can see some companies, and especially this one, able to create success after success. And so I asked him about that, and he actually answered me, which might surprise me. But what surprised me even more was the answer. Because he said to me, the issue here is you have to wear a turban. And I didn't get the point, but this guy, he likes his fairy tales. And he said, okay, because if you don't wear a turban, you wouldn't be able to catch the orange. And then he moved on to say, this is about serendipity. You know, something that appears which we didn't expect. And we have a lot of examples in the research commercialization history, right? The stuff by Fleming is one of the most famous examples. And he said, okay, this has often been misinterpreted because it's about being prepared for this. It's about being prepared to identify and capture these opportunities. Because even though we have a couple of thousand people working in research, we don't get that many good ideas. And when we get one, we need to be ready. We need to be able to recognize it. We need to be able to get the best and the most out of it. Because it can easily take a long time before we get the next one. So that's one point. Another point is that we see a need to differentiate between academic entrepreneurs and science-based entrepreneurship. And that was also something this R&D director, he pointed out to me. That since it's actually often a very small group of people who are able to repeatedly come up with these really good ideas, you actually don't want those good people to disappear with an idea and spend their life on trying to capture the value for it. No, you actually want them to stay with research and then let somebody else put the effort into commercializing it. So, so besides having, we need of course some academic entrepreneurs, but we also need to understand that a lot of it's about science-based entrepreneurship. And science-based entrepreneurship is very much about understanding and being able to operate between the tensions we often see between the academic system and the commercial system. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on all these details. Just to point out that we know that we actually have heaps of tensions between the business system and the academia system. We have them at a knowledge level, because it's different types of knowledge we use and create in those two social systems. We have different drivers for creating the knowledge. We have different criteria for certifying whether we rely or trust in that knowledge. When we look at the people level, yeah, that's the same. We have differences in norms, expectations, and motivations, and at the process, I think that many firms, especially in the beginning, they are quite frustrated around these differences in the processes, because they are so different from what they have in their own system. Because with science, for example, it's very difficult to work to a particular deadline, right? When we can't say set a date on when we get the good idea or when we get the right idea, and when we get the proofs and so on. So we have a number of issues here. What is important to know, and I think this is a kind of a second generation model for research commercialization, in the sense that in the beginning we believed that we should try to harmonize the knowledge spheres of business and academia and make them more similar. Because if they're more similar, of course, we reduce the commercialization problem and so forth. But the problem is, if we do that, then we also end up in a kind of a why bother situation. What is the value of engaging in this activity? So we actually need the tension. We need the different knowledge types. So, again, back to my PhD, that was a very, very clear point from all the people I interviewed in industry. They said, we want universities to do basic blue sky research. We don't want them to spend a lot of time in the research lab. We can have units associated with universities that do it. But in the research lab, they shouldn't spend a lot of time on thinking about our needs, because that's what we will do. We want them to come up with something which is surprising, which is reliable, and something we can work with. So maintain the difference. At the people level, we see a kind of a new breed in between these two. And some of them would be academic entrepreneurs, R&D managers, gatekeepers, and these individuals, they can sit in both universities or in private firms. And then at the process level, we have a lot of institutions to help out coordinating between these differences. When we look at then how the training and education of people acting in this mediating level, what is then going on? And here I'm taking an example from smaller economies. I'm a very kind of very much in favor of that we need to look towards similar economies in order to identify models that can work in our context as well. And when I look towards, for example, Scandinavian countries, I would see, okay, training is very much embedded in both informal and formal mechanisms. When we look at the informal, we have a lot of job mobility, job rotation, and so forth. Not so much between sectors. I think the some of the programs in EU are doing a lot in order to try to stimulate it, but a lot of the mobility and is seen within sectors. But that's very powerful for distributing knowledge and so forth. So employees that have been working for this R&D director I referred to before, they would go and work for other companies. They would bring the model along with them and so forth. They might engage in startup activities and so on. R&D collaboration in consortia is very important. Right? It's important for everybody taking part because thereby we get access to knowledge about how to assess potential, how to try to work with it, what is actually the procedures around commercialization and so forth. And I think for many smaller countries in Europe, then the framework programs, they have been extremely powerful in terms of facilitating this kind of knowledge sharing among firms and public institutions and universities. Knowledge sharing and groups and networks and so forth can be a kind of a more formal character and something that is taking place in many areas. On-the-job training, so somehow related to the other points around being exposed either in consortia or collaboration and so forth, where new staff, new PhDs or scientists, they would be trained in to understand how to work in these tensions and how to capture value from research. And as also mentioned earlier, then we actually see a great value in these entrepreneurship competitions hosted by universities all over the world, in the sense that it often, it might not educate so much, but it opens the mind towards another way to use your discipline. If you are educated in a particular scientific discipline, then you start thinking about, okay, I can actually use it, apply it in other ways that I might have imagined when I got into this program. More formal training, yeah, I've just taken a few of the more significant, and industrial PhDs is seen as a very powerful tool in many countries, where PhDs, they are associated with one firm, work on an issue within that firm, partly supervised by people in the firm and university staff, and would be expected to continue their career in this firm afterwards. It's accepted that the PhD would then be more applied in its outcome than a university PhD, but still you will get interesting results, you will get a network, and you will often get people that can act in both worlds, both in academia and in industry. Then another very important aspect is the professional training organizations. So in Europe, we have the European Industrial Research Management Organization, or association it must be, and they are running heaps of courses for people in different areas and functions and levels in their career related to research commercialization. And spans both people employed in industry and universities and so forth. And then we see a number of master programs at different institutions across Europe, which is a relatively new phenomenon. And I would say it's only within the last 8-10 years that we have seen this kind of more institutional approach to train people into this role. Okay, so moving to New Zealand and looking a little bit on a specific project. Then TEC funded a project with involvement of staff from University of Auckland and Human Services to look at how to improve the commercialization outcomes for the tertiary sector organization. And one of the things that came out of that project was to say, okay, since we have a very kind of a particular need for a particular toolbox, we actually need to center the education around a commercialization project. That might sound pretty simple and straightforward, but we just have to remember that we are here talking about a context where we have a high level of uncertainty and low level of predictability, and still we would like to create a kind of a predictable learning outcome. So it's not an easy challenge to run this kind of action learning project in this area. So, but nevertheless, it has now been running for 2 years, and we have had approximately around 100 students through a course related to the bioscience area. Then we have also created a new master program, a master in commercialization and entrepreneurship, which was launched last year, and this is for a part-time program for professionals with interest in research commercialization, entrepreneurship, and I will return in a second to more details around. We are also this year launching a new graduate certificate in innovation and entrepreneurship. And what is interesting around this program is that it's aimed at enabling undergrad students with a degree in science or arts, engineering, or something which is not business, to bring their core discipline to business. Meaning, we don't want to give them a traditional business education where they can go in and take traditional business roles. No, it's about enabling people to use their core undergrad degree in a business context. So we can say we are trying to educate people to sit in this mediating role. We have also seen that the program has developed increased awareness among staff, and I think that relates very much to this around the norms for academic work, that if we go 10, 15 years back, those norms mostly encourage academics to distance themselves from business. So we have actually a strong need for a little bit of awareness creation, and also a kind of a changed attitude towards business. And this program has contributed a lot to that, together with activities like Spark. So, now Will has already covered a few issues around Spark, but just want to, because in principle, then we can deal with any type of entrepreneurship activities in this entrepreneurship competition. Okay. So it can be anything from a new pizza shop or delivery service or whatever. But anyway, you can see that we have a lot of submissions which are science-based, and we can see they manage and perform really well in this competition. So if we look at for the past 3 years, then 7 out of 11 of the placed projects, they actually had research commercialization aspects to them, and would commercialize research from the university. If we look at the Master of Commercialization and Entrepreneurship, and just pull out a few characteristics, then since we aim at this mediating function, or people that would like to get a career as academic entrepreneurs, then we are very much focused on providing a toolbox for actually acting in this space, but also throughout the education build a network which can be utilized in working in this space. Because now Will said it's a kind of a people issue. It's actually more than that. It's also a network issue, right? It's not people within a kind of a narrow scope. No, but it's people everywhere, across disciplines, across functions, across types of organizations and so forth. And that's extremely difficult to build up when you need it. Right? So you actually need, and to get back to this about the turban, you need to prepare that before you actually have the idea you need to run with. There. Another thing we try to do is to deliver competencies just in time, meaning that we know that when we look at research commercialization processes, then it goes through a number of stages, and each stage is distinct different in its needs and the way we can approach it from the other stages. Therefore, we look at the disciplines and what they can contribute to each stage in this kind of just-in-time approach, instead of doing the traditional model we would normally use at universities, where we carve our content into disciplines and we deliver each discipline in a sequence, and then we hope students they are able to somehow combine their way through afterwards, which is okay in many areas, but because of the high level of complexity and uncertainty and so forth in this particular area, we have found it necessary to develop another model. What is also important is to develop some context-specific cases and models. Right? So we have put an effort into writing New Zealand cases, for example, Lancetech, Power by Proxy, and Comvita, which somehow tries to capture the unique situation of commercializing research out of New Zealand. And that could, for example, be to say, okay, one of the key differentiating factors would be that we know we have a lot less experience in industry around commercializing research than we would have in many other countries. How do we actually deal with it? How can we see that some of these firms, they have dealt with this kind of knowledge shortcoming? Okay, and just a little bit about the profile of candidates in this program. And as you can see, then they represent a lot of different disciplines. They also represent a lot of different institutions and work experience and so forth. And we hope that we, with this program, would be able to supply people that can mediate these tensions we saw earlier, and help preparing this turban so we can capture the value of the research outcomes. And in terms of the next steps, when we look at research commercialization education, then it's issues like continuing developing NSET-specific teaching material, continue developing models that actually fits to this subject, but also start looking at the education we provide to PhD students and maybe postdocs. Say, okay, what should we actually do in order to make sure that they come out not with the competence necessary to become an academic entrepreneur, but with the competence they need to engage in science-based entrepreneurship. So whether they have to pass on their science to a team or be part of a team that carries this research into a commercial world. Okay. Finally, because like any smaller economy, we often tend to look elsewhere, and we are happy to look at some of the great institutions in the US, for example, MIT. But here we have an example where MIT, they studied what is going on in New Zealand, and we actually came out pretty good. And they were impressed with what we are doing in terms of creating this innovation ecosystem and activities around research commercialization. Okay, thank you.
How effective is your master's course in creating entrepreneurialism versus the competition like Spark? How many of your 100 graduates became entrepreneurs and started their own company?
So, I wouldn't know that. I can say that we have launched it last year. We have brought them through the first year, and in the second year they have to engage in a research commercialization project as part of their master year. What we see as the main outcome from this is that we would provide people with the competence for doing science-based entrepreneurship. Okay, so they should be able to either on their own or in collaboration with others to take part in this process. To which extent they become entrepreneurs is not our main, entrepreneurs themselves is not our main concern, in the sense that we want, we believe that it's very much a kind of a team effort, and we need to line up the potential team members, and we have the other instruments somehow to wake up the entrepreneurial gene in people that might have that.
So you can teach entrepreneurialism or generate more of that in New Zealand through courses.
So, this is about teaching entrepreneurship. Okay, I think it has two sides. One of them is a competence side. And we can definitely teach the competence side. The other one is behavioral. Okay, and we have studies that document that entrepreneurs, they are actually a bit risk adverse. Okay, and I know many of you might find that counterintuitive, but that's nevertheless the situation. They are just individuals who are very good at dealing with risk and finding the information they need in order to make the decisions. But so they are not really, in that sense, what many of us would say, risk takers. That they just throw themselves, the house, the family, into the situation. No, they will often be good at this about assessing the situation and use that for making decisions. So my point here is that if we provide, the more people we provide with the instruments, the more people would actually feel comfortable when making the decision of starting out. And then of course we have entrepreneurship competitions and so on to maybe to wake make the desire awake at all, right? Yep.
The Master of Bioscience Enterprise, that got up and running first, didn't it?
Yes.
When was that?
I think it was in 2006.
So has it been formally evaluated by you in terms of the outcomes from the people that have been through the program? Or is it
Yeah, it must have been. Normally, then the evaluation is at 3 or 4 years after it's launched. Yeah.
You don't know how to?
I don't know the specific details. So I would expect it has done well because it has established collaboration with afterwards with some really good universities around in the world with exchange of students and so on. So I've never seen any evaluation, but I've only heard that they are doing a really good job with the students. Yep.
Hi. This year I've been teaching the MBA innovation course for Victoria, and I've got some of the quite a lot of students to actually go and interview entrepreneurs, quite usually really stage startup types. And despite the fact that a lot of these students are probably in their mid-40s and quite senior in some organisations, they actually came to me afterwards and said, "Thank you for pushing me to do this, because I was actually really scared about talking to entrepreneurs." And I wondered, because your students would be self-selecting into some of these courses because they're interested in it, but I wondered if you were working at all about making them cross into some of these other programs with your MBA to actually perhaps break down some of this cultural issue around entrepreneurship.
So I hope that the grad cert to a certain extent can do that, right? Because it would somehow get into the gap where people that get their science degree but might not exactly know what to do with it, and then they will get into our program, and we can start somehow pushing them in that direction. And I think, for example, when we look at the PhD workshop we would like to run, I think that's exactly what it can do, right? Take people that didn't have any somehow expectation to do anything active themselves to get into it and say, oh, okay, here, that's a story. This is what one can do, and these are some of the techniques, and so on. So we start this process of thinking about it.
Talked about the sort of cultural divide between academia and business and ways to bridge that. I'm curious, in terms of university research outputs, do you have a sense or a feel for how much sort of untapped value there is in what universities produce in terms of their overall research outputs? I mean, is there lots of stuff you think left on the table because the bridge isn't adequate?
Depends what you mean by left on the table.
Not
Yeah, I would rather turn it
dollar
around.
value, I guess. No startups, no companies, the sort of, I guess, financial value as opposed to public good value.
I would rather turn it around and say, okay, do we think we perform up to the level we can do as a society? And I would say no, hopefully not, right? We should be able to create more value. And capturing it from research would be one of them. And I think if we look at the other side of the story, right? Look at the ability of industry to recognize this potential and run with it. I think that might be where we have the bigger problem. Whether it's to run with New Zealand research or from Scandinavia or wherever, right? Because we see when firms, they develop a kind of an idea about how to work in this model, you know, they also go international in their knowledge sourcing. And they will pick up wherever they can find the most advanced knowledge they need. Right? So I would say the shortage would rather be in knowledge around how to get from science to dollars, more than this metaphor that we have knowledge piled up on the shelves not being utilized.
My question is for Will, I think. It's about the ATI. Have you, well, the ATI is still on the drawing board, as it were. Have you figured out how you're going to work with ATI? Or how you would like to?
Yeah, no, we have, and we've got some ideas. And I mean, I'm not particularly close to this. My colleague Mike Burgess, Peter Lee is, but there is a the gap we see in working with the ATI is there's a lot of particularly small to medium-sized companies in New Zealand that kind of come along with, we've got this sort of problem, but we're not quite sure what the research is, and the research is probably going to be in the region of, say, you know, the problem they've got is, in their minds, a $10,000 to $15,000 problem. Right? Is incredibly expensive to administer and serve service. All right, and if you look at where the market is broken in terms of that delivery of that science research, then we think that's probably a really good place for the ATI to operate and start to collect and to serve both the research organisations, who it's very expensive for them to do that, but also companies to try and get a better definition of what their real problems are. But we see ourselves as working very closely with the ATI because we're going to be a provider of research. You know, we're not necessarily certain that building another layer of, you know, another portal or a single portal necessarily, in our experience, you know, a good thing. I think that you would want to have continued multiple channels of places where people can and could go for their research needs.
But what's your appetite for working with those small firms on those $15,000 problems?
Well, at the moment our appetite's strong for them, but if somebody said, you know, to be honest with you, would you like somebody else to do that? Probably would, yeah. So I think there really is an opportunity for the ATI to get into that space and better define. The biggest problem of all is people often can't define the problem. If you can help them define the problem, you can get a better solution.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much to both of our speakers this afternoon. A really great seminar. And we've got tea, coffee, and biscuits in